We're looking at the context of the writings that silence women. There are just 2 passages in the entire Bible. They're not found in the 4,000-year history covered by the Old Testament, nor in the teachings of Jesus. They're only found among Paul's writings. In fact, they seem to be a new teaching. A section from the first passage says, "Women should keep silence in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as even the law says." And the second passage says, "Let the woman learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit the woman to teach or to usurp authority over the man, but to be in quietness." These are puzzling passages, so it's important to understand their context. Let's start with the context of 1 Corinthians. Chapter 7 sets a scene. Paul said, "Now for the matters you wrote about." Throughout the letter, Paul quotes the matters sent to him by the church, then gives his reply. So we're not just reading the words of Paul, but the matters the church wrote to him about as well. Let's put together a picture of what was going on at Corinth. Chapter 16 tells us that Paul was writing from Ephesus and that 3 friends had come from Corinth to visit him. "I am glad of the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus." They were, in fact, messengers from the church. Paul said, "They have supplied what was lacking from you." And also keep in mind that messenger is the same word as angel. Chapter 1 tells us that it was those of Chloe who had declared to him the divisions within the church, meaning face to face rather than written. So it's logical that they were the ones who took the letter to Paul and were in fact the 3 friends whose names are revealed at the end. So Paul's dealing with a whole load of issues, both verbal and written. There are 3 lots of voices: the church writers, Paul's response to what was written, and Paul's response to the verbal concerns of the messengers, those of Chloe, who took the letter there in person. No wonder many sections are confusing. They're not all the words of Paul. Sometimes he's quoting or referring to issues within the church. Let's look at an example. A tongues a sign for believers or unbelievers? A confusing passage in chapter 14, the notorious chapter that silences women. First we read, "In the law it is written, with other tongues and through the lips of foreigners I will speak to this people." So tongues then are a sign, not for believers, but for unbelievers. In the next verse we read something totally contradictory. "But if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and if unbelievers come in, won't they say you're out of your mind?" So clearly this is saying that tongues are for believers. 2 completely opposite views within 3 verses. It's obvious that one is the church view and that one is Paul's view. This is typical of how 1 Corinthians is written, Paul quoting the matters they wrote about and then responding. Some translators have started adding quotation marks in 1 Corinthians, and it dramatically changes the meaning. Here's an example in chapter 7 from the NIV. "Now for the matters you wrote about," quotation, "it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman," end quote. "But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife." This makes it clear that the red section is a church opinion to which Paul is replying. Let's read it without quotation marks. "Now concerning the matters you wrote about, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife." See the difference? This makes it sound as if Paul is saying it's good for men not to have sexual relations with women, when in fact it was the opinion of the church. This makes a dramatic difference when we're trying to untangle Paul's difficult passages. The contradictions disappear when we realize that not all the opinions belong to Paul. Even the translators realize this, but haven't gone far enough in making the distinctions. I was advised by one translator that it would indeed be helpful to make people aware of this issue of the many voices in 1 Corinthians, and that's what I'm trying to do. In chapter 14, the church is trying to silence women who are prophesying, a continuation of the speaking in tongues problem. We read, "As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silence in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as even the law says. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church." If quotation marks are added in the correct places, then 1 Corinthians would be transformed from a jumbled mess to clearly showing two sides of an argument, and this section would be the church view. And they weren't referring to the law of Moses here. The law of Moses didn't silence women. Roman law silenced women. And it's ridiculous to think that husbands at home can answer all wives' spiritual questions. In fact, Jesus said that he is the one we are to follow. Women are to go to Christ for their spirituality, not their husbands who might be foolish, such as Nabal, or dishonest, such as Ananias. So when taken at face value, this passage contradicts the teachings of Christ. It's obviously the church saying that it's shameful for a woman to speak. Let's see Paul's response. "What? Did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only ones it has reached? If anyone thinks they are a prophet or otherwise gifted by the Spirit, let them acknowledge, meaning perceive, that what I am writing to you is the Lord's command," what Jesus taught. "And if anyone ignores this, they themselves should be ignored. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, zealously prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues." Paul reminds the church that the word of God did not originate with men. It came to both men and women. He reminds them to compare his teachings with those of Jesus, the green section. He concludes the chapter by encouraging all to prophesy. "So, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues." The speaking in tongues is part of the controversy of this chapter. The NIV correctly translates adelphoi as applying to brothers and sisters here from the context of the chapter. Paul is addressing both men and women. Now let's look more closely at the reference to the Lord's command. When Paul referred to the Lord's command, he wasn't endorsing his own new teaching, but one already given by Jesus. So let's just read Paul's words again and then compare them with the words of Jesus. "If anyone thinks they are a prophet or otherwise gifted by the Spirit, let them acknowledge that what I am writing is the Lord's command. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, zealously prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues." And Jesus said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. These signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues." And they went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked through them, confirming his words by the signs that accompanied it. And there's no doubt from Acts that women were amongst this group. It was the great commission of Jesus that all should prophesy. And one of the signs is that believers would speak in tongues. How utterly ridiculous that Paul was trying to silence women with the gift of the Spirit speaking in tongues. It doesn't make sense. Sadly, in one of the biggest blunders possible, the church followed the wrong views of the Corinthians who Paul was correcting. Silencing women is a tradition of men, not of God. Paul's recommendation to the church is the one that wasn't followed. Paul encouraged all brothers and sisters to prophesy in church. And while we're in 1 Corinthians, it's worth looking at chapter 11 because understanding the context here as well clears up this chapter, the one that says that women should cover their heads, and also that man is the head of woman. On the surface, more new teachings from Paul. In chapter 11, the writers from Corinth thought that the origin or source of a person mattered. Man was first, so he must be more important. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now let's put quotation marks on this so we understand that it's the church opinion. And let's compare it to what Paul said. The head or origin of every man, meaning every one, is Christ. The head or origin of woman is man. This is singular. It's referring to Adam being the head or origin of Eve. In the Lord, however, woman is not separate from man, nor is man separate from woman. For just as woman is of the man, so also man is through the woman. So Paul wants them to know that the head of every man or every one is Christ. And moreover, Eve might have come from Adam, but every man after that was born of woman. And it would even seem that the first converts in Achaia were of a woman, of Chloe, which would make sense of this strange statement. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. So we're going to look at this more closely. The church had a real problem with the worship of origins, going back to chapter 1, where those of Chloe reported the church divisions of I am of Paul or Apollos or Cephas or Christ. It doesn't take much insight to see that those of Chloe were at the bottom of the pecking order among these big names. Chapter 11 focuses on who was first and therefore more important. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Paul ends the letter with this worship of origin in mind when he says, "You know that Stephanus and his household were the first converts in Achaia." Surely this is making the point that if first matters, then remember that Stephanus and his household were the first converts, and it's logical from the context that their origin was Chloe, a woman, which would make sense of their complaint about the quarrels over the big names. And in a beautiful reminder of what really matters, the things God cares about, Paul says, "And they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. Submit to such as these and to every fellow worker and labourer." So now we can make some clearer sense of the statement that a woman should have authority over her head because of the angels, the messengers who were taught the gospel by Chloe. It's the church that says a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And Paul's response, "For this reason, a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the messengers." Paul is saying, if your logic is true, then a woman is the origin of the messengers, those of Chloe, so she can do whatever she likes with her own head because she's the head of the messengers. And then he adds, "In the Lord, however, woman is not separate from man, nor is man separate from woman." The church were trying to separate men and women. In the Lord they are not separate, nor do they have separate roles, which is the wonderful equalizing power of the gospel. So this is the context of the difficult passage in 1 Corinthians. Paul going back and forth with the logic of their reasoning and correcting it with the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Now for the passage in Timothy that silences women. It's a different Greek word for silence. It means to be in quietness, and the context is completely different as well. We read of the context in chapter 1, verse 3. Stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer, or devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. The purpose was specific. Stop wrong teachings from spreading. Command certain people not to preach. This wasn't an isolated incident of silencing people with wrong doctrine. Paul silenced anyone with wrong teaching. Let's look at Titus chapter 1. There are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped. Rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men that turn from the truth. The circumcision party definitely included men, and Paul said they must have their mouths stopped. A similar situation to the silencing of women or a woman in 1 Timothy. Paul silenced anyone with wrong doctrine. So let's read the passage silencing women in 1 Timothy 2. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. And she shall be saved in childbearing, if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. The traditional interpretation of this is that Adam was formed first, therefore must be more important. The same thinking that we saw at Corinth. But would Paul command all women to be silent when he's encouraged them all to speak? Now let's keep in mind Timothy's purpose of staying in Ephesus, to correct wrong teaching, and view these statements from that perspective. So when Paul says that Adam was formed first, it's in response to the woman saying Eve was formed first. When Paul says the woman was in the transgression, it's in response to the woman saying Eve was not in the transgression. When Paul said she shall be saved in childbearing, it's in response to the woman saying having children hinders salvation. Now let's focus on the woman's wrong teachings. Eve was formed first. She wasn't in the transgression, and having babies hinders salvation. If we look at these teachings, we can recognize that they line up with Gnostic teachings. Modern scholars largely agree that they had views from Judaism and Christianity with Hellenistic and Egyptian origins and were flourishing in the 1st century. A Gnostic text from around the 3rd century shows the belief that Eve gave life to Adam and was considered superior, reading from On the Origin of the World. Sophia sent Zoe, her daughter, who is called Eve, as an instructor in order that she might raise up Adam, in whom there is no spiritual soul. She exclaimed, "Adam, live, rise up upon the earth." The Gnostics also believed that having children was evil. It created more vile flesh, and women who gave birth would be hindered from entering Gnostic heaven. So here we have a logical explanation to Paul's strange comments. So, in summary, Paul wasn't giving new teachings that women should be silent or cover their hair. Those were the traditions the church wanted to impose, hair-raising stuff for women who had the Spirit and were prophesying. Paul endorsed the things God wants, all to prophesy, do good works, proclaim the good news of the kingdom, just as Jesus had said. Paul followed the teachings of Christ. He said, "Follow me inasmuch as I follow Jesus." Paul's teachings must line up with the Son of God, who is the one who truly revealed God to us. I hope you found this helpful. You can find more detailed studies on my blog at this link. Thank you.